what is continuing now. The first problem, which is quite complicated and it remains complicated, is the matter of political prisoners, the people who did not commit any crimes but who were persecuted due to political motives and who are behind the bars now. According to our information, at least 149 of our citizens were behind the bars in 2022, either in Crimea or in infringement of international humanitarian law, were brought to Russian Federation. The majority of them are Crimean Tatars who were persecuted upon fabricated cases. At least 88 of Crimean Tatars are behind the bar based on such fabricated cases, which are absurd. The secret witnesses usually witness in such cases, which are mostly affiliated persons affiliated to FSB or FSB servicemen. If the barrister shows another expertise, that it's not accepted by the judges of the Russian Federation. Other cases of a big scale against Ukrainians is being accused of espionage, sabotage, and cases alike. At least 16 people are held behind the bars based on such cases. Such accusations are usually used against journalists or activists like Yaroslav Yasipenko or Galina Dovgopola, who is 67 years old and she got 12 years. Imagine that it's almost the life sentence for her. She's in the colony in Russian Federation. But besides the political persecutions, including persecutions for faith, because Russian Federation persecutes the witnesses of Jehovah who are being only accused for their faith. They're being sent behind the bars. For example, back in 2020, a person received 6 years only for have such opinions, such worldview. And in year 2022, Crimea not only became the military base, not only the place where the political prisoners are held, but it also became the prison for the people from newly occupied territories. I'm talking first of all about Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, which were occupied by Russian Federation, and they deported people from those areas to Crimea. First, they were placed, according to our information, in prison number 1. There were a lot of civilians among them, not only military, but then we found out that starting from July, the people started being detained in a new prison, number 2, and the FSB actually established it for the people who were deported from the occupied territories upon 24th of July, after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. There are volunteers, activists, even some foreign citizens who were involved in volunteer activity, for example, in Kherson, and the Russian military kidnapped and deported them. So usually the people are being detained according to certain lists for what about which we know, so-called the black list, which were prepared before the 24th of February, and it's in compliance with the practice which was implemented in Crimea before 2014, when FSB were coming with the ready lists, which contained the coordinators of Euromaidan and anti-corruption activists, civil activists, political activists. The same lists were drawn up for Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. And then after the beginning of occupation by Russia, such people were kidnapped, very severely tortured. They were detained in different places in Kherson and Melitopol. And afterwards, usually upon a few weeks, they were brought to Simferopol, and criminal cases were opened against some of them. Why some of them? Because some of people are still in Crimea without even cases opened against them. So formally, these people cannot be admitted lawyers to them because Russia does not recognize them as prisoners. For example, we know that people are imprisoned, but upon the inquiry of a lawyer, the lawyer is not admitted to such people who in fact are in such prison. This number 2 prison opened by FSB, there are at least 458 places there which Russia counts on. We know about 110 people detained there as of the beginning of the year, and those are the people deported from Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. They were tortured not only there, and after they are being deported to Crimea, the Crimean FSB tortured them to beat out the evidence. For some cases where cases are already opened, they are being accused of international terrorism, so-called. So those people are usually volunteers or participants of the ATO. They are accused by such articles. Sometimes they are being accused of espionage because it's surprising that Russia usually accuses only Russian citizens. Well, I want to involve Iryna Siedova in our conversation from Crimean Human Rights Group, and I want to ask this question. We understand that political persecutions were in Crimea before the 24th of February, so did the nature of such persecutions change after the beginning of the full-scale aggression? Is there anything new that we were witnessing? Good morning. I want to say that the policies of persecution became more severe, and the occupiers resort to horrific activities like kidnapping, torturing, and unfortunately now we have Ms. Danilovich, who was accused by fabricated case and kidnapped and kept in a cellar of FSB, tortured for more than a week. She was forced to sign some blank papers upon which the case was fabricated. It's a horrible case, and this is how they try to intimidate people. They kidnap people in Kherson region, they torture them and bring them to prisons. And this kidnapping is being documented by us all the time. It's a horrific situation, and we hope that publicity and detailed documenting will help us in future to stop such crimes. We also know about the fact that there is an active application of the new article of the Administrative Code of Russian Federation, which prohibits the discreditation of Russian armed forces. What can you tell us about cases like those or other expressions of repression, of oppression of people in relation to their stance against the war? I would like to focus on the pressure on the people for expression of their opinion. So it's a pressure on people who mostly support Ukraine publicly, who take anti-military stance, and except for Lyudmila Danilovich, there are 14 more Ukrainian journalists who are currently behind the bars. And for some of them, the award was brought for a number of years. For example, Yaroslav Yasipenko was tortured with electric current to beat out the evidences of crimes he did not commit. Iryna Danilovich received 7 years. It's a pressure on her civil position for about the publicity of the political cases committed. The Crimean Tatar civil journalists who actively cooperated with Crimean media initiatives, for example, Ramzi Kerov, who worked for Graniru, received 7 years in fabricated case. Also, Ruslan Soleimanov, Rostem Shuikhaliev received 14 years. Ramil Sumetov received 11 years, and they were the veteran of Crimean Tatar movement received 11 years for publication of Russian crimes, only for posting the video and comparing the Russian occupiers to the Nazis. So now the FSB is focused on the activists whom they were not trying to touch before the full-scale invasion due to their due to the publicity, and if somebody just was involved in civil activism, they were not touching them, but now they do. And even for the smallest expressions of patriotic stance, any average citizens, even for conversations with the colleagues at work, there was a case when a person just came to work and said something good about Ukraine, and somebody submitted a report for such person and penalized according to the article 20.2.3, and there is another article of the criminal code 20.7.3, and there is a number of criminal cases against people for spreading so-called fakes about the Russian armed forces, but people really write the truth about the crimes of Russian armed forces. So Crimeans are being persecuted for this. For example, Alexander Tarapon was accused of spreading fakes about Russian army for 2.5 years, and Mr. Volodymyr, what's the place of Crimea in the military campaign, which is now being performed by Russian Federation? Since 2014, Russians started preparing Crimea as a platform for invasion to Ukraine, and there was a number of projects that we heard about. There was a number of projects which were promulgated by Russian Federation as those which would improve the lives of Crimeans, but in fact they would facilitate the logistics for invasion, like for example Crimean Bridge. It was all supported with the active militarization of the life of the civilians, and the occupiers paid a lot of attention to our children and to younger generation, because a lot of those who at the beginning of the occupation were kids, now we see them enlisted in the Russian armed forces. They were forced to enlist during these draft campaigns and mobilization, and it was all done, it was all prepared since the time when kids were in kindergartens. There was an active propaganda in place. The separatists were involved for lectures for the kids, and people who were in Donbass fighting against Ukraine, they were telling those kids that the West wants to capture Russia. So those children, they were prepared to take part in the war against Ukraine. Within all this period, Russia held 16 draft campaigns. So they passed about 40,000 citizens of Crimea through their armed forces, and those who didn't want to be enlisted, they were persecuted, and we documented at least 429 such cases, and year by year we've seen the number of such cases only to grow. And I have to emphasize that even after accusation like that, the person was not exempt from the obligation to serve in the armed forces of Russian Federation. Also, after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we've seen how Russian Federation uses the peninsula of Crimea. It has a branched out network of airfields and ports, and the massive missile strikes were inflicted on the civil facilities from Crimea. I'm talking about, first of all, about cruise missiles like Onyx and Iskander, based on the vessels. Crimea has a network of warehouses and storage facilities which provided better logistics for the occupiers' forces. Also, the armed forces of Ukraine performed a number of successful operations in Crimea. Maybe the most successful was the attack of the airfield in Novofedorivka, when there was about 10 fixed-wing aircraft of Russian Federation destroyed. Also, there were other facilities destroyed, but I think we will find out about that somewhat later. And unlike Russian Federation, Ukraine inflicts strikes only on the military facilities, and there are no reports of civilian casualties after the attacks by Ukraine.
Mr. Bohdan, as a lawyer, what would you recommend how the situation should be dealt by the Ukrainian government or the governments in the world friendly to the Ukrainian cause? In general, the year 2022 has been marked by the phenomenon where we see the increase of the military activities since the full-scale aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. The citizens of Ukraine are in the situation when they are forced to resettle from their houses and places of residence. These include people who left the Crimean Peninsula since 2014. There are those who have been forced to flee. In the last year, the government has been paying a lot of attention to the issue of the displaced persons. We have developed this procedure of recording of displaced persons. You can get recorded through the DIA application. You can also provide documents through this computer application. In many cases, people would leave without their documents available. We have seen also the increasing number of the people receiving the monetary allowances, and the limit has been done away with the maximum money that every family is entitled to. Apart from these positive steps, we should also take notice of the procedural actions by the government when the government is trying to keep record of the displaced persons. This means that a social worker can visit the alleged place of residence of a displaced person. In case such a person has not been found there, such a displaced person is bound to come to the office. Otherwise, the monetary allowances will be cancelled. These visits are scheduled for the working hours, and more often than not, people would be at their working place. And in fact, these displaced persons are not bound to stay at home all the time. This is not the first time we've seen such mechanisms implemented. We have seen such procedures when the temporarily displaced persons are checked, but these procedures were dispelled as unlawful back in 2015. There's another issue that is outstanding yet, the issue of pensions for the persons who have been registered in the city of Sevastopol or in the Crimean Peninsula. In case such people resort to receiving money allowances, they were sometimes in the situation when they were turned down, because according to the Ukrainian situation, in such cases, you need the documents from the Russian Federation pension fund, and this doesn't seem to be liable. And in general, such an additional condition as asking for documents is discriminatory in its nature as far as the Ukrainian citizens are concerned, those who have been previously registered in the peninsula of Crimea. Another issue that we paid special attention to, as well as did the government, is the protection of people who has been deprived of personal freedom as a result of the armed aggression. Even prior to the war, the law was passed on the protection of people who has been deprived of the personal freedom resulting from the aggression, and At the legislative level, these people were protected by the Ukrainian legislation. In March 2022, an investigative commission was working in terms of identifying people whose freedoms were violated. Accordingly, such persons were paid allowances, and it should be noted that the commission included the civil rights activists, including the experts from the Crimean Human Rights Group. The President of Ukraine has also decreed on the issue of the reintegration of the Crimean Peninsula and the city of Sevastopol. That was supposed to be a body that would combine all the activities, including non-governmental sector, as far as the deoccupation of Crimea is concerned, but this body has not been up and running so far. If we have questions from the floor, please give me a sign. The mic is yours. Valentina Genel from Ukrinform. A couple of questions, if I may. We can go one by one. The first question concerns what happened this morning, the searches in the Crimea. As you will have known, there were massive searches of the Crimean Tatars. 6 persons were detained. Do you have any information concerning these searches? In particular, what particular articles they have been or may have been accused of? In a nutshell, I will tell you that this information is something we received this morning, and of course, we don't have enough time to check that information. But this is very remindful of what FSD are doing. As the rule, they would show up in the morning hours and accuse people of the terrorist activities. This is what they do in general. They search houses in the morning, alleging that they are searching the houses of the terrorists. As a rule, they would accuse people of participating in the Crimean movement, and this is what we have heard so far, when convictions are as long as 11 to 19 years of imprisonment. We are still gathering such information to check it, but more likely than not, the accusations and convictions will be in that strain. It is very typical for the Russian occupying force, what they did a year ago. The searches were conducted, people were detained, including Crimean Tatars. We see some periodical repetition of the searches of the Crimean Tatars, accusing them of the terrorist activities. We see that the history repeats itself. As for the mobilization, it is still going on in the Crimean Peninsula currently, and who are being called up. Formally, the mobilization has not been turned down. The mobilization points were set up before the Putin's decree for mobilization, which is called the partial mobilization, as it was done in September. The so-called head of the Crimean Peninsula announced that the mobilization was over. However, all these call-up points and the commissions are still up and running, meaning that at any point in time, people can be called up. We see some tendencies here, the trends that the Ukrainian government is pointing out, that the new wave of mobilization is likely to get going in the coming weeks, because Russia seems to be planning another wave of attacks. So perhaps in February, the mobilization wave will still be getting momentum. But the call-up campaign is still going on. These are conscripts that will be serving in the Russian army. But since the year 2022, we see 2 parallel processes, calling up and mobilization. Calling up mobilization will get started in the upcoming months, the logistical basis is available, and this is done according to their internal procedures. What we saw in September was that the Crimean was quite fast, on fast track. When Putin decreed about the mobilization in the city of Kerch, we saw 6 buses with the inscription Z ready to take people to get them removed to the Russian Federation, where they were distributed to different military facilities. We can also add here that the Ukrainian citizens living in the occupied territories, which is in the face of the Geneva Conventions. Indeed, this is a military crime. What we saw back in 2015, what we saw last year, and I will tell you more. This is not the breach of the international law, but the kidnapping of people, including Donetsk and Lugansk regions. The men were abducted. The way the mobilized personnel are used in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions also falls under the category of military crimes, because they serve as the human shields protecting the lives of the Russian military. This is another military crime that Russia is committing in the occupied territories. Another question, please. You might also dwell into the issue of the sentiment of the population in the occupied Crimea. Recently, we heard that the United States insisted that the high-precision weapons should be delivered to Ukraine for Ukraine to be able to target Russian military bases. What is the general sentiment, including the collaborators and the occupying force, and in general, the people living in Crimea? What we are seeing now, the pro-Ukrainian people, those who adhere to the Ukrainian cause, their sentiment is getting stronger and stronger. This is very evident. We see the inscriptions on different buildings, quote, and I quote, "Glory to the armed forces of Ukraine, glory to Ukraine." And in addition to that, in spite of all the persecutions, criminal or otherwise, people are not afraid to voice their stance. The slogan of "Glory to Ukraine" leads to a 15,000 fine in Ukraine. And we also know the Ukrainian folk songs, Red Weiberburn. If you sing that song, you're also criminally liable. The so-called judges call these Ukrainian folk songs, and they baptize them as the Ukrainian war slogans. For example, Ukrainian national anthem, also singing of the Ukrainian anthem would lead to investigation. As for the collaborators, what we now know is that the so-called officials affiliated with the law enforcement of Russia, they would relocate their families. What I am saying is that personally they wouldn't leave the place, but they are doing everything they can to get their relatives away from Crimea. They are well aware that the Ukrainian armed forces sooner or later will come to the Crimean Peninsula. Step by step, according to what is possible, people are doing what they can, and the collaborators and the Russian citizens are trying to get their families back to Russia. The last question that I have, and I would challenge you to answer. This Ukrainian Media Center has been working with the foreign journalists for a number of years. If they were to ask you, what is Crimea for Russia today, in a one sentence, what is it? Is it a military base? Is it a ideological narrative important for Ukraine? What is the Crimea for Russia today? In a nutshell, Crimea was the beginning of the Russian aggression. Because this aggression was allowed to take place, it was not punished back in 2014. It has led to what we are now seeing now, the full-scale aggression. This is what the whole world is watching. To me, the Crimean territory is the area of international responsibility. You cannot flirt with such leaders as Putin. You cannot tolerate the fact that the sovereign territory of one country has been violated. It should not be allowed. It was allowed in 2014. Now in 2022, the whole world is challenged to find the tanks and the weaponry and the munitions to protect Ukraine. I would like to address other panelists. What would you add here? I think it's the matter of delivering a fatal blow to the Russian military. This is a symbolic place. And I think Russia, once they are defeated in that campaign, they will lose their faith in their leadership. At this point, I think we should wrap up. Bohdan Melnykovych, Volodymyr Chekryhin, Iryna Siedova, and Olha Skrypnyk, all are aspects at the Crimean Human Rights Group. Thank you very much for the information you have shared with us today. As for the journalists, I invite you to keep track of our events. Stand with Ukraine.